Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today, and I want to thank our host again, Sonny Perdue. All that was said about him is absolutely true. I would add a few other additional thoughts. And in politics, sometimes you meet folks who may not be as steadfast or grounded as you might hope. After having a chance to work with Sonny and to get to know him over these years, I can tell you he's not only a great leader and a great governor, he's a wonderful person with a big heart, and he has got his compass set, and he is grounded. And Sonny, thank you for hosting this wonderful event today. We appreciate it. I wish my wife, Mary, could be with me today. She's back in Minnesota, and of course, as with you, significant others and spouses can play a really important role in keeping us all on track and properly focused. I was standing in our bathroom out in our Eagan, Minnesota house a month or two ago, and things in my overwhelmingly Democrat legislature were not going so well that week. I was feeling discouraged and kind of beaten down and feeling, oh man, things aren't going to go so well. And I was looking in the mirror and I thought, man, look at me. I said, Mary, look at this. My hairline is receding. My hair's turning gray. These crow's feet around my eyes are multiplying by the week and deepening. I've been traveling nonstop, eating junk food and not exercising. I'm turning into a flabby guy. I said, look at these love handles are flopping over the side of my belt. I said, is there anything that you can tell me that would give me some encouragement or some positive reinforcement? She looks at me and says, well, hey, man, there's nothing wrong with your eyesight. So I just share that with you because there's a lot of challenging news that we read each day in the newspaper and see on television and otherwise. The economy in many parts of the country is sputtering. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. The energy crisis looms large. We're a country that seems to be divided and polarized politically in ways that are sometimes frustrating and concerning. But I hope each of us can step back from that and just remember on a broader scale that we live in the freest and most prosperous nation in the history of the world. There are no people, any place, any time, anywhere that have experienced more freedom and more prosperity and more liberty than those fortunate enough to live in the United States of America in these modern times. I'm grateful for that. I hope you are as well. And I found a recent ad by Harley Davidson kind of interesting. Some of you may have seen it. It was in some of the major newspapers across the country a week or two ago. It was a full-page ad and kind of the language that only Harley Davidson can kind of put out there, and I can't do it justice, but to paraphrase it, it was, as a nation, we've been through wars, we've been through natural disasters, we've been through crisis, we have been through various, challenges, and we've rallied together. And the bottom of the ad said something like, blankety blank, let's ride. And we can do it. And so, one of the things I try to share with our Republican friends across the country when I have a chance to visit with them is, hey, look, if you want to take the most successful page out of, one of the most successful pages out of the Republican playbook, you go back to Ronald Reagan. And here you find a leader, with a few exceptions, who was always hopeful, who was always positive, who was always optimistic, who was always civil, who was always decent. People want to see, particularly in troubled times, leaders who have some sense of hope and some sense of positive direction and momentum. People don't want to buy in or be part of something that's negative and dour and dirt-kicking and skeptical. And so part of the responsibility of leadership and opportunity of leadership is to project a positive, hopeful message for our party, for our states, for our country. That's why I think this debate that we're going to have this fall is going to be good and healthy and robust. But I want to just share a few thoughts with that in mind about energy. And Sonny asked me to speak on today's topic about environmentally friendly, pro-business energy policies. And as a backdrop to that, I'll just share with you some perspective from somebody you may remember and recognize. I hope you do. His name's Peter Drucker. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 95. Many believe he was one of the most profound strategic thinkers of our time. Over the course of decades, wrote books on strategic thought and management, and well-respected inside and outside of business. A woman wrote a book that it was published about a year ago called The Definitive Drucker. The Definitive Drucker. And she spent the last year or two of his life interviewing him as he was in the very twilight of his time. And it was kind of a summation of the best of Drucker, his retrospective thoughts on business and life and strategy. And he lived long enough to hear about and think about the work of another person, happened to be from Minnesota, Thomas Friedman. The world is flat, right? Everybody's aware of it, and some even sick of hearing about it. But this woman asked Drucker, what do you think about the concept, the organizing premise, that the world is flat? And you know what he said? Not for very long. Not for very long. Think about that. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but Drucker said it is misleading and misunderstood to say the world is going to be flat over time. That in a hyper-competitive global economy, there will always be nations and states and regions that gain comparative advantage, and over time, for various other reasons, comparative advantage will dissipate. That in a hyper-competitive, hopefully market-oriented global economy, people will continue to strive to maintain or gain comparative advantage. And the notion that everything is going to be the same everywhere is a temporary and perhaps misguided notion. Interesting and profound thought. So what does that mean as it relates to energy? Well, as people deploy capital and make investment decisions, we heard some of it in the panel discussion today, if you're going to invest large sums of money, particularly in fixed capital assets, you're going to look at a number of factors, one of which is costs. Costs manifest themselves in taxes and regulation and insurance and mandates and a bunch of things, but one way that we measure costs, and when particularly businesses were to invest and do business, is energy costs. And so we are going to be part of our equation for gaining or maintaining or losing comparative advantage is whether we're going to be able to provide an environment as a city, as counties, as states, as regions that have competitive and hopefully economical energy costs. Haley touched on this morning, that cost is an important factor to consider. So what does that mean? We have a world where demand for energy has met supply and in some ways may be exceeding it. This is not a mystery. Many people have chronicled this and thought about it and predicted it for quite some number of years. We have the rise of China. We have the rise of India. We have a global marketplace that is devouring energy at a rate and pace and scope, the likes of which we had not previously seen. And our challenge is to make sure that we have an energy supply that is reliable, that is hopefully cleaner, but is also economical. How do we do that? Well, we have to increase supply. And we also have to conserve it as well. But let me just speak to diversifying, increasing our supply, and I would go one step further and say Americanizing our energy supply. Now, you've all heard people speak about why we should do this. One reason is it is a national security imperative. We have today $130, maybe a little less, a barrel oil. It doesn't get reported very often, but it is not uncommon for there to be physical threats to the oil fields in places like Saudi Arabia. Last year alone, there were 2 or 3 serious attempted incursions into those oil fields and related facilities. If one of those would have been successful, you would have seen not $130 a barrel oil, but in my opinion, $200 a barrel oil overnight. Overnight. And if you think we are all gasping for air now in this debate, just think if that happened. The tension or the elasticity in these markets is so tight that even the prospect of one hurricane coming through the Gulf changes the futures market. The prospect of a overhaul of a particularly significant refinery changes the market. That is how tight, that is how small the margin of areas that we're running on in this country. That is unacceptable for the world's leading economy, I think. So, but from a national security standpoint alone, we do not want this much of our national security posture hooked to places that don't like us, are hostile, and in fact want to do us harm in many instances. Now, we import, as you know, 60% or so of our oil, for example, from foreign sources. That's going up, not down. It's going to be 70% pretty soon. Now, some of that is from places like Canada, and we still have pretty good relations with Canada. But, the rest of it, directly or indirectly, comes from places like Venezuela and Hugo Chavez, and it comes from places like, indirectly or directly, the Middle East, including places like Iran and Ahmadinejad and Putin continuing to use energy as a pressure point relative to Europe. So we have to unhook this from a national security standpoint, from a national economic standpoint. It is not healthy or good to have this much of our economy attached to this roller coaster. It's good to diversify. It's good to Americanize. I would also suggest to you, if we do this correctly, it's an opportunity to improve our environment. We want to do things in that regard that are consistent with Republican principles and market principles, not things that are reckless or goofy. And lastly, it presents an opportunity for our country to open up a new economic sector, not unlike the IT revolution of the mid-late 1990s. Now, this is a little different because it's much more capital intensive. It's not like having two college students in the basement, inventing software, and then they go from, Old Navy to billionaires in 2 years. This is a little more elongated outlook on it. But it's an opportunity for economic growth and development if done correctly. Now, as to what we need to do everything. As I mentioned this morning, there is no one silver bullet. Governor Hoeven said this with respect to North Dakota. We are going to need to do it all. The magnitude and sense of urgency that we have around this issue should propel us to not rule out things, but to rule them in if they are within the range of reasonable thought. Starting with the fact that when you look at baseload energy in our country, if a pie chart of baseload energy, give me a little grace here because this is a little off and it varies from time to time, but in general terms, half of our baseload energy in the United States of America comes from coal. About 20% of our baseload energy comes from nuclear energy sources. About 20% comes from natural gas, and the rest is miscellaneous stuff. The technology that is coming that may help us and the breakthrough that we all hope for is not yet here. That pie chart represents an energy platform that is large and is very significant and complex, and it is very difficult to change on short notice. So we have to come to terms with that pie chart in the near term. There'll be other options in the intermediate and long term, but in the near term, if you look at the pie chart principally as coal, nuclear, and natural gas, coal in the United States of America is plentiful. It is cheap, it's available, and it's Americanized. We would be wise to find a way to access and utilize that resource. The catch, of course, is we're all hoping for this next generation clean coal technology, and with the exception of some modest demonstration projects or projects that are related to particular geology, it has not really taken hold in a widespread or economy of scale availability. It's coming. It'll be here, I think, in maybe 3 or 7 or 10 years, but it's not here yet. So we're stuck in kind of this awkward in-between phase, but we need to find a way in the spirit of doing everything to utilize coal and do it wisely and do it responsibly, but we need to find a way to do that. And we're not quite there in terms of the support that we need in terms of R&D and the commercialization of the technology and the economies of scale. And I think we're going to have some help getting a couple of these larger demonstration projects pulled across the finish line, and then hopefully they can be demonstrated, achieve economies of scale, and that'll help. Nuclear is going to have to be part of the picture. It has essentially no emissions, but the ramp-up time is long, the regulatory process is difficult, the political environment in certain parts of the country are not open to it, so it will be part of the answer, but because of those limitations, it may not be the whole answer, but it certainly should be advanced. Now that leads us to our utilities saying, look, if you box me out on coal and you box me out on nuclear, I got no choice but to do natural gas. Natural gas is cleaner, but we are already a net importer of natural gas, and it's price volatile, and it's getting increasingly expensive. So it leads you right back into the position that we sort of are in now relative to oil, namely we're dependent on it from foreign sources. It's price volatile, it does burn cleaner, so that's not the complete solution either. And then, of course, we have a future that is going to involve aggregated solar, and continued development of wind, biomass, biogas, and the like that will help. But that pie chart and fundamentally coming to terms with, my friends in some quarters of this debate don't like talking about it, how are we going to come to terms with coal and how are we going to come to terms with nuclear on baseload energy? Also, just quickly talk a little bit about transportation and biofuels because this is such an important part of the discussion. And I will suggest to you that hydrogen fuel cells are really fascinating, but they're a ways off. The current generation of biofuels that was developed and pioneered is not where we need to be. It was a reasonable and good start, but it's going to have to be supplemented by next generation technology. The hope is, and again, it's not demonstrated yet, but we have lots of prospects for this, is cellulosic ethanol or related technologies. Instead of burning food for fuel, You're going to take waste products that could include fast-growing trees or the byproducts of the wood industry or switchgrass or municipal waste or other forms of agricultural byproduct and waste, potentially break it down not with heat but with chemical compounds or bioorganic compounds. And these types of demonstration projects are unfolding across the country in potentially exciting ways, but they're not ready yet. So we hope that they'll come forward. If they do, they're going to be 8 or 9 times more efficient than the biofuels technology that we have now. They'll use 1/10 of the water to run the plants, and their energy in, energy out ratios are going to be dramatically better, we think. But they're still probably 5 or 10 years away. So what's going to happen in the meantime? Well, you're going to see in the next few years plug-in electric cars probably be a significant part of the gap that's going to get filled in transportation. And the answer with all this stuff isn't to tell people they can't do things. I had people in Minnesota say, Governor, you're kind of open to these conservation ideas. What about if we make everybody drive dramatically slower? I said, no, we're not doing that. We already got too much congestion. The answer here isn't to tell people to stop doing things. It's to get the technology and the research and the innovation to help them do things that they love to do and need to do and enjoy to do in a smarter way. So let's get to work on the next generation of technologies. Plug-in electrics are very promising. GM, who has a representative here, is going to have the Volt out on the marketplace in a couple of years. It's going to be in production, I think, next year. These plug-in electrics in their early form, I was going to say primitive, but I don't want to discredit it. It's in their early form is going to be 30, 40 miles per plug-in. Pull it in your garage at night, plug it in the wall, and it's going to be backed up by an engine. The engine can be run on gas or on biofuels, but you could potentially have a car that runs on next generation biofuels, say E85, with a plug-in electric engine. The two combined 30 miles initially per plug-in or more, backed up by an engine that will be high efficiency. The average of that could be 75 or 80 miles per gallon. And GM and others are saying you give them 3 or 5 years after that, they will have a 50 mile per plug-in charge, and then higher than that. Average American drives 35 miles a day per vehicle. So if you can put a plug-in electric in the hands of more and more Americans, you're going to make a big dent in our transportation need. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is it takes 7 years to turn over the American car fleet. So even if everybody bought one tomorrow, the large-scale transformation of the vehicle fleet wouldn't happen for 7 years. And the other thing is, when you plug in a car, what do you got to have? Electricity. You're back to the pie chart. And we got to have the pie chart addressed. So I will predict to you that a big part of this is going to unfold in the form of plug-in electric hybrids. And don't assume these are little clown cars. Tesla's got a high-performance plug-in electric car. Now, it's expensive, but it'll take you 0 to 60 in like that. And you're going to see at least reasonable size or smaller size SUVs and other options coming out in the not-too-distant future. I want to just close, though, and tell you that we can do this. Tom Friedman is, I'm proud of him because he's a Minnesotan. I don't agree with him on many of his political views, but at the end of his book, The World is Flat, when he first wrote it, it was a skeptical, cynical, discouraging kind of note on the book. It had kind of a heavy tone to it, that maybe we can't overcome this. And then he got out of Washington, and he got out of New York, and he drove around America, and he met entrepreneurs and innovators and dreamers and designers and scientists, and he came back and he wrote a different prologue to the second and third edition to the book. And it concluded dramatically more optimistically and hopeful and positive. And the reason it is because he said he met the spirit of America, and he said we are the great dream machine. That if we're not going to be the biggest in terms of population, and we're not going to be the cheapest in terms of some of the cost measurements, then we better be the smartest. We don't just mean book smart. I mean, we got to have entrepreneurs and dreamers and designers and engineers and architects and artists and the people who are going to create and innovate. And that spirit is unleashed through freedom. That spirit is unleashed through liberty. And guess who can bring that to you the best? Sonny Perdue. And I believe Republican and market-oriented leaders. Government has a role to play, but we need to make sure we understand what its limits are and how it can be most effective. I'll just close with one last quote from Peter Drucker. He said, this about the future: the things that got us here will not get us there. Pretty true for energy, I think. You think you're going to stay on the current platform from the 1970s? I mean, how many people Republican, Democrat, Green, Independent, nothing, or something else, really took the energy issue seriously over the last 30 years, regardless of political perspective, and can point to major advances and accomplishments over the last 3 decades in the country. I'd say, as we say, and not so much. You know, we could have done a lot better job, but now everybody's got the message, and we're hopefully going to move forward. But Drucker said this: the best way to predict the future is to go out and invent it yourself. And that's what we need to do in this energy debate, and we're going to need all of it. We're going to need clean coal. We're going to need nuclear. We're going to need all of the new technologies. We're going to need the next generation biofuels. We're going to need solar. We're going to need wind. We're going to need biomass. We're going to need biogas. As we do that, we should make sure it's consistent with market principles, and we also should make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that there are some realities, namely that pie chart, that we're going to have to come to grips with and address and educate and raise awareness on in the near term. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great rest of the day.